Good morning. Bonjour. Good morning. You're all very welcome to this conference this morning. And as I wait for people to take their seats, I just say this is the first meeting we've had of Group 3 outside of Brussels in the last 2 years. And I think it is fitting that so many older friends, but people who are making new friends, new members, get the opportunity to meet and to socialize. Yesterday was an extremely good day in terms of the visits and of the evening. But we learned some things, or at least I did, from Group 3 as well. I learned that when we're organizing events, we have to consider including everybody. And unfortunately, at the boat last night, Pietro could not take part, so my apologies, Pietro. And also, I know Sif, who's here as well, couldn't take part. So we will learn as Group 3 because these principles are important to us. And I'm just sorry we didn't organize. Some of these matters were definitely outside of our control. But nonetheless, I am saying to you publicly, this won't happen again. Other than that, I would like to welcome you to this conference on a day, or in days, that the European landscape has changed. Every table last night, the discussion was Ukraine and the suffering that's happening. I just had a phone call from an older friend from Lithuania, Mindaugas, just there before the conference. He's working hard trying to do whatever he can. And I'm sure many of you and your organizations are doing the same. So forgive me if I begin the morning by reminding us that in the context of this conference, everything has changed. Le changement climatique et la transition énergique. So, forgive my French, but that is the name of the title. So before I begin and introduce the speakers, those of you who are interested, and sure all of you should be, there was a major report again yesterday, which I think everybody should read. Yes, we have a disaster in the Ukraine, but we didn't really know, or maybe we should have known about it, but we do know about the climate disaster that is approaching, and we need to talk about it. The seminar today will look at these issues and will, I hope, explore them further and will allow Group 3 to continue formulating its views on this matter. So that's my very beginning. I have an inaugural speech, which I will give in a moment, but I think it was important that I just say those words. So I would like to introduce to you my good friend on my left, Thierry Libaert, who is one of the French members of our group, and he will talk to you in a moment, and who has, along with his other colleagues, have completed a lot of work in order to bring this conference, so I thank you. And I would also like to introduce you to Serge Orru, President of the Advisory Council of French Academy for Climate. I'd like to thank you sincerely for allowing us into this beautiful building. So in that sense, maybe I will just hand over to Thierry, who will just introduce you better than I can.
Oui, peut-être Serge, non? Serge, tu veux d'abord? Oui. OK. Oui, moi je voudrais simplement souhaiter la bienvenue au nom de la délégation française de notre comité.
On behalf of the French delegation of our committee and our group, I don't know whether all of the members are here because with the lights I don't see the people. But the French delegation is made up of Patricia Blanc, Rachel Brichoil, Chiara Corazza, Joël Destam, Dominique Gillot, Arnaud Schwartz, and Laurent Sellos. All of this to say that from a very practical point of view, if you have any questions on Paris, don't hesitate to contact us. If you're staying beyond the time of this meeting, don't hesitate. Now, as far as the topic chosen today, I think it's very much linked to the report published by Group 2 of the IPCC on Monday. There was also a study done on the words linked to this climate change. And the major word linked to this is the subject of energy. When we talk about this problem of climate change, more than industrial policy, mobility, etc., we speak of the word energy. So we see that this is the subject which is most treated, most dealt with. Now, at all of these symposia, because I'm sure that many of you have heard people talk about the subject of climate and energy, well, the first thing consists in going beyond the observation, the assessment of the situation. If we go beyond all of the round tables, panels, etc., looking at trying to find solutions. And what's important is to departition the subject of climate and energy. You know, when we talk about the subject, very often people talk of environment issues, but this question of climate change goes beyond just that. The climate change issue is a subject of public health, social inequalities, and this is also a problem of geopolitics, access to resources. We're going to even talk about advertising. So I think that if we really want to launch a discussion on this subject, we need to departition it. This is something that we need to bear in mind throughout today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thierry, and for those words. Now, to introduce you to the president of the Academy, Serge Orru. Serge.
Merci, Président. Merci, Thierry. C'est un grand bonheur en tant que
Thank you,
citoyen
President.
européen.
Thank you, Thierry. As a European citizen, it is a source of great happiness to be able to welcome you here today at this Académie du Climat. It is a place for training young people. It is a place to pollinate ideas, to help try to change, to transform our society so as to be able to face not climate change, not climate upheavals, but rather what we are faced with today, the climate danger, the climate peril, because it threatens the world society. It is important to train our youth, not just to say that, in fact, biodiversity is being reduced, but also to transform our society, which today, with regards to the predation of climate change, how do we invent an economy which has a lesser impact on the environment, on human health, and a lesser impact on biodiversity, which is vital to us? The Académie du Climat was desired by the Paris mayor. It opened a little over 6 months ago. It operates in a way whereby it welcomes a public which is young, but there are many activities organized so that this place can, in fact, have repercussions in the rest of the world. We need to have these climate academies throughout the world, in Europe and elsewhere, so as to train youth so that they can ally their activities to the economy in which they are working, an economy which will not be harmful to future generations. So welcome to the Académie du Climat. I hope that you will take back with you some very interesting things and that you will be able to sow these Académies du Climat throughout Europe and the world. I have many contacts with my friend Thierry, and you will always be welcome here at the Paris Académie du Climat.
If I may, can I present you with a memento of Group 3? So, as we will, our guest speaker will be coming shortly. She is Emmanuelle Wargon, Secretary of State to the French Minister for Ecological Transition, with responsibility for housing. So before, just to give you some thinking and some thoughts from a mixture of myself and indeed the members of Group 3, it is useful to say that today we do discuss climate change. And it's interesting that we will discuss it, as I said earlier, in a time when suddenly oil, gas, and all of the fossil fuels are probably going to go through the roof in terms of price, in terms of even availability. In my own country, I know there's talk that some gas will have to be even rationed. I used to hear my parents talking about rationing because they lived in World War II, even in Ireland, and this is the first time I've heard that word. So things are changing, and yet we do have to, as I said, discuss it. It is not a frivolous subject because it is an impending disaster, and I think the report yesterday makes it very clear that we really and truly must deal with it. Scientists confirm that 1.8 million animal and plant species are at risk of extinction. 25% of plants are threatened with extinction. These losses, while being deeply tragic, affect all of us and affect the future of the planet and indeed human existence. All biodiversity is interlocked. We know that. And we all rely on the different parts and the different chains of that biodiversity in order to provide our own food and indeed to exist as human beings. So we are at a pivotal moment. And that moment is, are we doing enough, or do we have to look at the extra piece of work needed? And in particular, we in civil society who are facing all of this, are we still doing enough? We also need to bear in mind that under the principles of just transition, we need to bring people with us. Unfortunately, in Europe, depending on your numbers, there's 20 million, although I heard last week much more, on the breadline or on poverty. So those people have to be brought with us. And therefore, we have to bring with us the kind of facilities, measures, legislation, and support to ensure that we don't, as President von der Leyen has often said, leave people behind. So we're talking about cutting emissions even at faster rates. That may not be enough. We're talking about heavily investing in the preparation of emergency plans. Last September, we had a very good Group 3 meeting where we had members in this audience who were witnesses to the incredibly sudden flooding, which caused a lot of damage in places like Germany, Belgium, and in other places. So devastating were these, and so surprised were people who had to endure them. We were then told by many scientists that, frankly, we can expect more of that. And if we're going to have more of that, that means we need funds, we need emergency funds, but in a way that is not enough, because it still means that when these floods or when these extreme weather events happen, people are in danger of losing not just their homes, but their lives. And I think that we saw very graphically last August, and indeed we hope to produce a video of that meeting where these witness accounts were taken. And you know, members, which you are, of the EESC are effectively witnesses. You're witnesses because you are with civil society. as we found out in COVID, civil society is the place where the first reports of any problem arises. As I said, just had a phone call from Mindaugas on Ukraine. Those of you who know Mindaugas, and we all know and love him, and we all joke with him, and we all call him all sorts of names, he was a great member. He's out there in the field organizing supports for Ukraine. You too are doing the same. I know I've talked to many of you. So you are the witnesses. That's what civil society people do, and I hope that will never change. In climate change, you are also the witnesses, because you have to ensure, on the one hand, that we save the planet, but that we bring people with us, and we don't allow those who make policy decisions based on profit forget about those on the ground who will usually have to pay for them. I think that's really important, and I think that has to come through the conference. Yes, the European Green Deal and the Fit for 55 package are both necessary and urgent. Some say they're enough, some say they're not. They're there and they will have to be improved. Unfortunately, the transport sector remains the big problem. 95% of trucks in Europe consuming fossil fuels. That really is not going to meet any targets signed in Paris or anywhere else. Energy accounts for 2 to 3 of greenhouse gas emissions. In the 20th century, oil fueled our economies, our societies, our geopolitics. We're seeing that at the moment. We now have to move to renewable sources. We've got to get serious about it. We've got to form the kind of energy cooperatives at local level, and we've got to find, through science, new ways of tapping in to renewable fuels. We can't wait any longer. We have to achieve these targets. The EU has said it has the funds to realise the objectives. But we do need to speed up the political will. And sometimes, even if we have the money, the political will is lacking. I don't want us to come to 2045 or 2040 even, and suddenly to realise we should be doing something in a way that Europe came to the realisation before Ukraine that we have to do something. Unfortunately for climate change, trying to do something in 2045 will be very, very late. And then we will be spending all our funds on emergencies. So that's the challenge. Ultimately, it is my firm belief that access to energy and clean energy is right. This is why it is imperative that climate and energy transitions, as I said, are just. The new EU Social Climate Fund to tackle energy poverty is the way forward, but it will have to increase considerably. Above all, there must be regular and constructive dialogue between citizens. This is where you really come in. This is where you, as citizens, representing the various organizations you come from, have to be really honest. You have got to continue advocating to your governments, through your organizations, that change must happen, but change in a way that is real and sustainable. The final point I would make is that it relates to the involvement of all of us, particularly in the system of advocacy and also the delivering of projects. Many of you are involved in renewable energy projects, circular economy, all of that. But in a sense, all of what we are doing is the small stuff. We need to energize, to use a word, the major powers, the major companies, to seriously not just address changing the light bulbs and doing some small things like that, but to address the fundamental issues, our reliance on oil. We have to address that if we're to make any progress. So, as we're in France, I'd like to close my part of this by referring to the French political philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville, who argued that the collective business of society should be done voluntarily by the people themselves, rather than by government. That's what civil society tries to do. And I share that belief because it is us who will continually bring forward the real challenges. So, may I say, I hope you will enjoy today's conference. I want to hear everybody get involved. I don't care what point of view you bring, but bring it, because, as I said, you are the witnesses to what people's ordinary lives are like, and you are the true speakers for those people, for our people, for us, for your families. So I'd like to thank you for listening to my introduction, and I hope our guest is in the room, otherwise we will take questions and answers. So I'm just checking, not here yet. So I'm going to open the floor. I'm going to have people talking, and we will ask questions, and I want you to raise your hands if possible. I don't know if there's a microphone anywhere to hand around. You can take this one. Just to make some points, because I think all of you are well able to, Sylvia has a microphone there. So if somebody wants to make a strong point or even ask a question, even in terms of Group 3, we will do so while we wait for our guest. Thank you. Don't tell me we're all shy at this hour of the morning, so please. Yes, we have I think it's Elena Calistro.
Thank you. It's always the activist that needs to interrupt such moments. Thank you for having us. I don't want to, because I'm coming from Romania, so from the eastern part of Europe, I don't want to push too much on the Ukraine subject, but I think that there is something very important that we have heard in the first part of the meeting, and that we should keep in mind always. That at least for us in that part of Europe, what is happening right now was foreseeable. We had the signs, and I think that to the same extent, what we're seeing with climate, it's of course at a different level, rather the same. I am really fearful, and I'm trying to learn as much as possible from what is happening right now, that we are not capable as a society to mobilize until it's very late and we see the consequences of these catastrophes. And I think that what we can do as civil society is to, of course, speak about it and trust those that are standing at the very front line of tackling these issues. And at the very beginning, I was feeling very guilty to be here because we have refugees coming from Ukraine, and my organization and other organizations are working really hard on this. But then I realized that these are things that need to be still on our agenda, especially climate change, and that as a Group 3, we have the luxury, if you want to call it like this, to also work on systemic issues and not only on crisis. And I think that this is something that we can do probably better than those that are doing a great job for us and are being first responders. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, for that. Okay, and well earned. Thank you. Okay, we'll now introduce our speaker, and I would like to welcome the Minister, Emmanuelle Wargon, to take the microphone. As I said, Secretary of State to the French Minister of Ecological Transition, with particular responsibility for housing. Emmanuelle, please, you're very welcome. And while you're taking the microphone, I would like to simply thank you for doing this for us. As you know, Group 3 are, as I said, the witnesses to civil society, and the audience you're speaking to are people who are, as Elena so well said, activists and people who work on the ground. Thank you very much.
I use this one. So, Mr. President, dear Seamus, thanks for giving me the opportunity to take part in this meeting. And of course, I will switch to French. This one is not working? It works? Okay. Monsieur le Président, cher Séamus Boland, Mesdames et Messieurs les membres du groupe Diversité Europe du Conseil économique et social européen, Mesdames et Messieurs, je suis très honorée d'avoir la possibilité d'introduire cette séquence qui en fait s'inscrit dans une actualité très particulière à 2 titres. D'abord à cause de la crise géopolitique majeure que nous vivons en Ukraine, bien sûr avec les conséquences tragiques que nous observons en ce moment.
I think we have an issue on translation. Sorry.
No problem.
Have we
It's okay.
issue? Is it okay now?
It's okay.
Do you want me to start again or do you continue? Yes, okay. Bien. Monsieur le Président, let's
Mr.
start
Chair,
again.
let's start again.
Chers CNS, Mesdames et Messieurs,
Ladies and gentlemen, I was saying in my introduction that I was very happy to have the possibility to speak with you this morning in a current context of current events, which is very important. The first news is obviously the crisis we're living through in Ukraine, which is an opportunity for me to express our solidarity on the part of the government of the French people and the solidarity in Europe with respect to the Ukrainian people. This crisis in Ukraine draws attention to the requirement to reinforce our independence with respect to Russia in terms of energy. But even before the invasion, the increase in price of oil and gas in the context of an economic crisis shows how threatening this dependency is with respect to families. And the second factor in current events is obviously the new IPCC report that was published yesterday, which demonstrates the humanitarian urgency does not erase the climate urgency, that climate urgencies and events of extreme nature are really weighing heavily on the world's ecosystems, and that the risks are increasingly severe, and especially if we are not able to limit this to 1.5 degrees. We have to, the IPCC wants to intensify our efforts to reduce the emission of carbon and to help vulnerable territories. So there's no alternative. And at the same time, the path to energy transition and ecological transition is a path that is difficult and demanding, because the need for transition is there, and it draws to attention the limits of our current model for development over the last decades. We have to change the way we're going to be housing, feeding ourselves, and moving around, working and consuming. The imperative for reducing energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions makes families more fragile. They don't have the means to change their daily practices quickly. I'm thinking about those who are living near their working place. And I talked about the Ukrainian crisis and the climate crisis, but we've lived in France 3 years ago the Yellow Vest crisis, which showed that when the transition is not yet onboarded and not yet not enough accompanied, when we don't put into place solutions before we impose additional constraints, the population cannot accept the transition as it is presented. The crisis led to a great national debate and a citizen conference on climate, and the climate and resilience law that we adopted in 2021, with an imperative to adopt this little by little as we move towards more demanding requirements. France is currently president of the Council of the European Union, and it's an opportunity for us to carry high and strong these things in front of Europe. To affirm our carbon neutrality by 2050, what's new, is the Fit for 55 program, targeting a 55% of reduction of greenhouse gases by 2030. This packet touches upon all sectors of activities, decarbonization of housing, of transport, and renewable energies, which must make it possible to create incentives to accelerate the development and deployment of transition technologies in all markets. The French presidency of the European Union has set for an ambition to help negotiations move forward during the presidency to help develop general orientations of the Council by the end of the first quarter. Our first pillar for action is soberness and energy. I think we all agree that the best energy is energy saved. There are emissions that we don't make. We're working in several directives that would reinforce our action in this respect, the first of which is a proposal about the energy efficiency. The Commission published a draft proposal for review, and this is still under negotiation in the Union. The second purpose was a global objective of efficacy by member states, which we need to rise for each step to reach the Fit for 55 limits. And in the more direct actors, the directive on energy performance of buildings. The text was made public by the Commission last December, and we are starting to examine that now. These fundamental texts have already been made informal exchanges amongst ministers. They grouped together by Barbara Pompili about a month ago. These exchanges will continue next week in Nice during a conference of ministers on housing and construction that I'm organizing, because it is important that ministers in this sector be fully involved in the decisions that will make it possible to decarbonate our energy mix and to reduce our consumption in the building sector. Obviously, decarbonation of the energy mix itself and the deployment of renewable energies is the second pillar of the strategy. To replace our current consumption of fossil fuel energy, which is mostly imported, to raise by 32 to 40% by 2030 our consumption from renewable energies. This ambition is carried forward by the change in the directive on renewable energies, but also by the legislative package to encourage development of the use of hydrogen. And the last aspect has to do with the extension of the carbon market, the carbon trading market, which is not yet covered. This is a proposal for extending the mechanism of ETS in transport and buildings. The proposal was important because it was necessary to encourage incentives to the transition in transport and buildings, which are highly emissive. Obviously, this comes back to my first point about the factor involving private individuals in transport and housing. Very sensitive, because the issues and the abilities for transition are not the same as for enterprises, and this is the subject of discussion that's ongoing today in the European Union. The proposal for extending ETS is added to by adjusting border adjustments to carbon consumption and for objects manufactured in the European Union. To succeed in these exchanges is creating the conditions to limit our dependency on the international markets of energy and to reduce the invoice of energy issued to our fellow citizens. On the national level, France has been highly committed in this area. I'd like to get back to some of these commitments where I was quite mobilized. First of all, energy performance of our buildings. In France, it's roughly half of the consumption of energy comes from buildings, and buildings are roughly 1/4 of our greenhouse gas emissions. We have decided thus to act on housing in public buildings and on private buildings. Insofar as housing is concerned, we have totally changed our system by unifying all of the aids with one single financial aid called MyPrimeRénov', because 1 million applications have been submitted since it was introduction 2 years ago. We also decided, after the Citizen Agreement for the Climate and after a long discussion in the National Assembly and the Assembly, to prohibit renting poorly insulated housing. This is based on the rentals. This is not the same thing to prohibit people that live in their houses than housing is being rented, because it's an economic action. So we decided to prohibit renting the worst leaking homes by 2024 and in categories E by 2030. This requires a very strong accompaniment, which goes through labeling artisans with a label that is called RGE, which is, you can have information about from specific windows called, from a thing called France Rénov', and there's a personal accompaniment. And this also requires funding of work by La Prime Rénov' help, and a new mechanism for loans, which makes it possible to be reimbursed upon sale, avance rénovation, where the principal is reimbursed at the time of sale or the succession, if the owner dies, to make it possible to finance the remainder. In terms of renovation of public buildings, we have invested massively, up to 4 billion euros in a recovery plan to finance renovation of state-owned buildings and community buildings, 500 million for social housing and third-party buildings. We have created a trajectory for obligation of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and energy consumption, which is called the tertiary decree, which fixes the main features of that up until 2030. And in new buildings, we have decided that on a very ambitious regulation, which enters into force gradually, is called the RE 2020, which is working on the life cycle of buildings based on from building to decommissioning. We're working on the carbon impact in the life cycle with the objective of reducing greenhouse gas by 30% in the building, especially over the cycle. We have also, in the framework of this regulation, prohibited the use of gas in collective housing for new buildings, starting in 2025, and for collective buildings. Lastly, we worked on another topic which has an important impact on climate change, and that is the struggle against artificialization of soil. We know that soil is both a way of storing carbon, but we know as well that the artificialization of soil, with the corollary of urban spread, is one of the elements that will contribute to the greenhouse gas emissions. So we decided to have a national objective, zero artificialization by 2050, which is also a subject of many discussions, because the objective requires that we review our model of urban planning, which has to be reconciled with the demand of our several citizens to find affordable housing in the areas that they wish to live in. So we have posed this objective in the Climate and Resilience Plan law with various milestones, and we have decided to invest in the reuse of unused land, whether it be industrial or urban or commercial unused land, to say that all of the land that has already been artificialized need to be replanted, and we have to be able to create equipment and installations for people who are in need. And we've already invested 500 million euros in a rehabilitation program for these land areas. So there are many challenges, and there are many demanding challenges, and they require action on all areas, local, national, and European, and international. This is the meaning of the conference today, and I think you're already convinced that the energy transition is at the heart of the fight against climate change, and that this work needs to be done in all levels. We have a priority over the long haul by 2050. We have the question of the milestones and the trajectory to get there. For me, the key item is acceptability. The fact of not forcing transition and social change so that we can be able to accompany each person in their practical changes before we pose obligations that would not be reachable otherwise. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. I would like to just quickly, and I'm aware that you have a very tough time, if there's just one question, and bye-bye, I will ask you. Sorry, I can only allow because...
Okay, I'll take one, but after I do need to go.
Yeah, and I thank you for that. Bye-bye. Quickly, a microphone. Quickly, yeah. Iba is the president of our 10 section, which deals with the lab of this area.
Bonjour, hello. Yes, dear Madam Secretary of the State, knowing that your professional interest lies in the housing and construction and also building area, and knowing that next week you are arranging also a ministerial conference on the same topic under the French presidency of EU. I wanted to say that we are working and we are with you on the many issues. We issued opinion on renovation wave. We are working on new European Bauhaus initiative and also working particularly on minimum energy performance certificates. You mentioned that a lot of efforts under the renovation wave Europe was being emphasized in the public sector, but not so much in the private sector. Therefore, we are doing this study that we will share with you. I wanted to ask one question, particularly knowing that you are in the hurry, regarding the renovation wave, and we made some already good ideas asking Commission has provided a breakdown of elements of various EU and recovery funds that could be used to alleviate energy poverty, because it's linked together with this issue and phenomenon in Europe. But it is up to national or local authorities to navigate in this complex landscape. Is it somehow possible to do this navigation easier, because we know that there are a lot of funding available for the housing and building sectors, but they are in different areas. Are you working on these issues? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Baiba.
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
C'est vraiment une innovation de la
It's really
présidence
an innovation
française
of the French presidency
de réunir
to
les
group
ministres du
together
logement
ministers of housing in the European Union, housing and building. This is not a format that already existed, because housing and building are usually national issues. And by putting together this conference, which has had an echo because my colleagues are interested, we thought that it would be good to talk about three things. The first of which is housing and energy, in order to see exactly how we can start with these objectives in our housing policies. How can we include the renovation wave, and how can we as well better draw the parallel with the community parallels? The second area is to pick up on the new Bauhaus initiative, and explicitly on the order of the day of this meeting, decided by the Commission and organized by the President. And the other question is affordability. Housing needs to be affordable, and there's a potential contradiction between issues of renovation that is necessary for our climate issues and for quality of life to fight against precarity, and the issues to have a right to an affordable housing, because not everybody can finance the work, because not everyone can live in city centers, and we have a problem of production. In all of these areas, we will need to go after community funding, whether it be budgets, or whether it be financing by structural funding, or funding from the European Investment Bank, which will be present and which is a partner and which can be even more of a partner. Now, this remains the national application because everyone has their own organization of this type, and we now have a system in France about renovation of private housing, which is starting to work well, complementary to what we're doing for buildings in local communities and government buildings. So the system cannot be organized on the community level, but it can benefit from a community of will and funding, and that's what we're going to be discussing in Nice next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and please give a round of applause, and thank you for being here. Thank you very much. Okay, we're pretty much close to the beginning of the next session, so I propose that I hand over to Thierry Libaert and guests to start getting themselves organized for the next panel, which will be Climate Change, Where Are We Today? So maybe Thierry and guests, I'll ask you. There will be lots of time for questions and answers in that. We've tried to design today in such a way that there is time for people to ask the questions when they want, or at least to get more interaction, rather than fill the place with speakers. So take a small break while we get ready for the next panel. Thank you very much.
Donc, je propose de démarrer.
I suggest we start the session under rather surprising conditions because I think you understood that the earlier roundtable session was supposed to participate on a remote basis, but because of technical problems, we're switching panels. Now, the second problem is that of the three speakers of the second roundtable, they're not here, so we'll do as we can with the people present. The idea behind this roundtable was to start the discussion on the subject. So we have two speakers who are going to work on advertising and this social dimension. But I guess we can immediately start with the subject of youth. Because if there is a type of public who can really be concerned by the subject here, it is youth. For that purpose, we are lucky because we have someone here representing the European Youth Forum. This is an interesting organization because it federates, I think, more than 80 youth organizations in Europe. So this is really the organization representing a European youth movement. So maybe I can give you the floor immediately. So Assia Oulkadi, you have the floor. Can you hear me?
I'm going to be speaking in English, I'm sorry, because I had, this is my working language, so it's going to be a bit easier. So my name is Assia Oulkadi, and I work at the European Youth Forum, which is the largest youth organization in Europe, which represents young people, and we work on the different topics, including youth rights and also sustainability and climate, of course. Our member organization, and thank you for the invitation to the ESC working group, our member organization around Europe, and not only the environmental ones, are taking the topic on the climate crisis very seriously, and we are making changes inside the organization on trying to be ourselves a bit more sustainable. We are also raising awareness. A lot of work of our member organization have been around raising awareness, education programs, non-formal education, and so on. In addition to that, we have also been engaging both with citizens but also policymakers, and I think this year is the European Year of Youth is really the opportunity for us and for policymakers to be listening and including young people a bit more in political processes. The other one that I wanted also to add is I would also like to thank young people and civil society, but also youth organization, because if it wasn't for them, also the Friday for Future movement, school students, young activists around the world and in Europe that are also mainly responsible for putting the topic on climate on the political agenda. I'm not sure that the European Commission would have actually presented the European Green Deal at the end of last year if it wasn't for the involvement of young people and youth organizations. However, as young people, we are not only here to highlight what is not going well and what is wrong, but we're also here to also ask to be included in policy making. So also thank you for the invitation of today. The second point that I wanted to raise, we've had started to talk about it this morning around the question of inequalities, geopolitical issues that climate has, that the climate has, is that most of our efforts on climate do not tackle the root causes of the problem. Not even the Green Deal, and it was raised earlier today in the speeches. Our real problem is not the climate change. It is a symptom that, of course, do have several impacts on both individuals, marginalized groups, but also and especially on the global south. And we also, as a European institution and civil society, also have to be aware of the impact that you have on the south. The biggest problem and the root causes of the climate crisis is overconsumption and overproduction. And I'm going to give you some figures here. For instance, the extraction and processing phases alone of materials, fuels, and food make up for about half of total global greenhouse gas emission and more than 90% of diversity loss and water stress. What is worse is that all of this overproduction and overconsumption doesn't even make us happier. As European, studies have showed that above a threshold that the vast majority of Europeans have already reached, material wealth does not lead to a corresponding increase in happiness, well-being, or health. Our consumption isn't fairly distributed. So if everyone consumed like us, European, we would need more than 2 planets to sustain it. For instance, 1% of the world's population is responsible for more than 50% of emission from flying. The other point as well that I wanted to raise, and I think it's also something that we have seen as a European Youth Forum while attending the COP26, is that the problem is that we as the Global North contribute the most to polluting, but the ones that are contributing the least to the problem, the Global South, are paying the highest prices. For instance, people are dying from air pollution each year, and more than 5 million deaths per year are attributed to the climate change. We also currently seeing the huge impact of desertification, and I'm quoting here some region in Morocco, for instance, where you have only 6% of water reserve left for this year. The other point that I also wanted to mention is how we can work together on a sustainable future. The first point that I had already raised is really about involving all relevant stakeholders in political processes. So whether civil society, young activists, together with institutions to actually, and this is also the space today, to make up and think together for solution. It is now that we have to think about the solution, but also make investment before it's too late. The other point as well that the European Youth Forum will be working on is that we actually need from the European Commission targets on overconsumption, and also stimulate the debate on how we can move beyond the growth dependent economy, sorry. It was raised earlier in the discussion, but I think we really need to move from an individual responsibility to a more thinking about more systemic approach to the topic. We need, such as the Vice President of the European Commission and the European Environmental Agency, we actually need to address this topic. Climate action means that economic system change and young people will have to be addressed. We demand 2 things from the European Commission. First is that we need to put our brains together and talk about it, so establish institutional platform to investigate and develop EU post-growth policies. And the second one is that we need to act, and it needs to be done now before it's too late. It's about introducing a science-based binding targets for EU material footprint reduction to keep the level of consumption within planetary boundaries. And that needs to be multiple sectorial and submaterials target that should be set for 2030, 2040, and 2050. Thank you.
Merci. Merci beaucoup. Donc, en attendant les autres intervenants, on va
Thank you very much. While we wait for the other speakers to arrive, I think that we can perhaps talk a little bit about this youth issue. Before taking questions from the audience, I would have 1 or 2 to ask. You have spoken of many youth movements in favor of the climate. When we look at the profile of young people mobilized in favor of the planet, it is a public of students, master students, graduates, etc. Can we really speak of an awareness among youth on the climate subject, or are we simply speaking of a specific profile type of young people with diplomas, graduates? In addition to that, 2022 is the European Year for Youth. Are there movements being organized in conjunction with Europe on the subject?
Yeah, I'm going to respond in English, sorry. And I hope it's fine. So in terms of the involvement of more wider groups of young people in the climate movements, it is not only a specific type of profile. So the most one and the more visible one are obviously more educated and maybe more active in youth networks and youth organization. I think there are more and more young people who are aware of the climate issue. And it is also the role of youth organization in raising awareness, and we do it like the role of youth organization is essential here, and we already have programs, for instance, in schools where we have younger people or people who are not aware on how much the climate crisis is affecting them or will affect them to do this work. The second question in terms of the European Year of Youth, there are different activities that are planned this year, and I think two ones that are very interesting is that the old commissioner, so European Commissioner, have agreed to actually meet with young people and organize roundtables, all of them, to meet young people and to discuss topics that are relevant for them. And then the second one is, as the European Youth Forum with the ESC, we also organize the EU Climate and Sustainable Roundtables. So every three or 4 months, we meet one commissioner directly with the members of the ESC to discuss a topic. So the overconsumption was the topic we discussed with the Vice President Timmermans. We will also be discussing economy to really have a discussion on systemic issues that are affecting the climate crisis.
Ok, merci. Est-ce qu'il y a une ou deux questions dans la salle?
Are there other questions in the audience? We're going to bring you a microphone.
Hi, it's not so much of a question, more just kind of, sharing some of the key points that you mentioned that I think are really pertinent. So I think that you mentioned that, despite the fact that most of the emissions are being kind of created in Europe, people in the global south are suffering kind of disproportionately. But I think another key point is that racialized communities in Europe are already suffering specifically and disproportionately. And so it's quite disheartening to hear policymakers, discuss acting now for future generations, when really we need to be acting now for generations now for people who already, are living in energy poverty, people who are not able to access, culturally specific and basic, safe and healthy environments and housing and other things. And another kind of key point that I really appreciated that you make is that it's important to kind of shift our political and economic thought from sustainable development, from, greenifying practices that are damaging to the environment, and kind of towards more like equitable, democratic and decolonized economies, stimulating like community wealth building and things like this. So I just wanted to thank you for the points you made. I thought they were really brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for a good presentation. I do agree so much with the former speaker. One thing I'm amazed about with the youth generation of today is your ability to include other groups, the groups that have been marginalized so far. I represent myself, persons with disability, and I know many of the youth organizations are really good at reaching out and including the groups that have been marginalized so far. So for me, it's really, I think if we must achieve what we want to achieve, we have to include everyone. And we have to use the resources of everyone, because a person with disability can also contribute. A person who has been marginalized by racism can also contribute. But we need to work together in order to solve this crisis.
Hi, Assia. Lutz Ribbe. I'm a member of Group 3, and I chair the Sustainable Development Observatory, and you know that we have a cooperation, you and the groups, and our NAT president, Peter Schmidt. And I very much appreciate this engagement you have spoken and you have told us, but a more practical question. How can we bring all these topics closer to pupils, for example? Can you imagine that we start together projects? We want to be climate neutral. Why not starting initiative at schools to do pressure on the cities who are owner of the schools, and that pupils start, we want to have solar panels on our roofs. We want to become climate neutral. We want to see the buses driving us to the schools being more environmental friendly. Could you imagine that we come together, you, young organizations, the committee, and that we develop such kinds of projects together, and we help you in doing pressure on the politicians?
Maybe I can already start responding or just reacting to the question that were asked. So yes, in terms of the racialized communities and also marginalized group in general, there is also a report that was launched a few days ago by the European Network Against Racism, and I really invite you to have a look at it because it's also highlighting how much the climate crisis is affecting marginalized and racialized group. And I agree, we have got to work with groups that are marginalized and excluded from the political processes and the decision. And for that, we need to invite them to this type of meeting, but also have a frank discussion on what is preventing them from participating in such processes. Is it financial opportunities? Is it also access to information? Is it language barriers and whatever? And then we also have to work towards solutions together. The second point that was asked is around pupils, so students and pupil schools. We have, as the European Youth Forum, been working with the Commission, who has presented a few weeks ago a proposal on including sustainability and education. And the point that we had raised as the European Youth Forum is we really would like to have teachers being trained on this question, on the topics of sustainability, but also having funding from the European Commission going to schools to develop programs on raising awareness on activities that youth and pupils can do in schools. But as a member of the European Youth Forum, we also already have members very much active at national and also local level who are actually doing activities with schools, with young people at national and local level to raise awareness on the impact on the climate crisis and how young people can act in their daily life to tackle it. But obviously, when it comes to the work with the institution, we're always trying to keep it as a more systemic level because the responsibility is not on young people to tackle the climate crisis, even if we have a role in it, but it's on the institution to adopt the relevant policy and also to fund when it's necessary.
Are there other questions for Assia Oulkadi? If not, then I suggest that we move on to the next speaker, Agnes Michelot, who I thank for taking the floor unexpectedly now. Agnes Michelot, in fact, is one of the people in France who is well known for the subject of environmental law. She's a member of the IUCN. She's vice president of the Environmental Law Organization. Agnes Michelot, a few years ago, headed the she gave, in fact, the EESC an opinion on the question of climate justice. And this is really one of the levers looking at the climate change and the social consequences. And I think that one of our colleagues from CN1 was the rapporteur. I think that this, in fact, shows the link between the French EESC and what we are doing at the European level. It's good to have these different opinions. A number of people had been audited by Agnes Michelot. And in the introduction this morning, I was saying that the climate subject is perhaps less an environmental issue than a social issue. I always have in mind the sentence that says, if you want to see where the environmental problems are, you have to look towards the most underprivileged. And if you look at the causes of the climate change, we can place the blame on big companies, on large fortunes, but the impact is on the poorest populations. So I think we're going to look at the problem between climate change and social inequalities.
Oui, je crois, oui. Non. Ah.
Vous m'entendez mieux?
Ah, oui.
Très bien, merci. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci à
Thank you,
tous pour
Mr.
cette
Chair. Thanks
invitation.
all for this
C'est moi un
invitation.
honneur.
It's an honor for me to be here.
J'ai effectivement participé
I
au Conseil
participated
économique, social,
in the
environnemental
climate
français à
and
l'avis Justice
change and
climatique
environmental
2016.
in
C'était un avis de
2016,
la section
and the
environnement
opinion of the environment section
français.
of the French
Nous avons
EESC.
effectivement été
And we
auditionnés,
were at a hearing
au Conseil économique
at the EES in the
Donc,
European Committee.
ce sujet
This
sur
topic
la dimension sociale
about the social dimension
en lien avec le
of
climat
the
et
climate and energy topic,
me semble
it seems
plus
to me
important.
it's the most important.
Mais je ne suis pas très objective.
But I'm not very
En tout
objective,
cas,
obviously.
me semble assez
But it
central
seems
par
quite
rapport à toutes les
central
réflexions,
with respect to
sur
all
la
of the
transition
reflections going on
énergétique
about the energy transition
dans un contexte d'urgence écologique.
in the context of an
Alors le
urgent
sujet est
urgency.
complexe
The topic is
parce qu'il
complex
envisage donc cette
because
dimension
we
sociale.
have to move
Or,
forward on the
que
social
recouvre
dimension,
exactement
but what
la dimension
does the
sociale?
social dimension cover exactly?
S'agit-il d'aborder
Is
une
it
transition
dealing
énergétique
with
juste,
fair energy
donc permettant
transition,
d'avancer
making
sur des politiques
it possible for us to move forward on ecologically responsible energy
sans peser
policies
sur les plus démunis?
without burdening the
S'agit-il d'avoir des
underprivileged?
politiques
Or
énergétiques
is it
qui n'accroissent
having
pas
energy
les
policies that do
sociales?
not increase
Ou
social
encore,
inequities?
s'agit-il juste
Or is it
de
just fighting
lutter
against
contre la précarité énergétique?
energy insecurity?
Alors nous sommes effectivement dans un contexte
We
social
are in
compliqué où
an
les
increasing
familles, les
social
ménages,
and
comme nous avons
inequality
connu,
context.
doivent choisir entre
Do we have
payer
to fight?
le loyer ou
Do we have
payer
to
les factures de
choose
gaz et
between paying
d'électricité?
rent or
Et on identifie une catégorie
feeding your
croissante
family?
de ce qu'on appelle les
And
pauvres énergétiques
there are
au niveau
increasing
européen.
numbers of the energy poor in Europe.
Cependant, le sujet est encore bien plus
So this
complexe
is even
dans
more
la mesure où les
complex to the
seules
extent where
circonstances
the only
individuelles
individual circumstances
ne permettent pas
are
de
not enough
comprendre tous les
to,
enjeux sociaux de
to
la
consider
relation
all of the
entre
social
climat
issues
et
of the
énergie.
relationship between climate and
Il faut
energy.
intégrer l'impact
It
des
is necessary to integrate the
le
impact of
contexte
public policy,
institutionnel, économique,
institutional,
infrastructurel,
economic,
qui vont
social and
ou non,
infrastructural contexts
améliorer ou
that can
augmenter
improve or augment
la précarité énergétique.
fuel poverty and precariousness
Donc on a des difficultés à
dealing
avoir un
with energy.
constat
So there's a
clair
difficulty in
avec une
having a
vision
clearly
large
established
sur les
observation
conditions
with a
de
broader
ce qu'il faudrait
vision
considérer plutôt comme la
on
vulnérabilité
what we can
énergétique.
consider to be the conditions of
On
energy
ne peut pas se
vulnerability.
concentrer uniquement
We
sur la
cannot
pauvreté
concentrate
dont la
only on
situation est
poverty.
tentée. Il faut considérer
We need to
tous les
consider
facteurs
all of the
qui
factors
vont
in
faire que des
play
personnes vont
such
basculer
that the
dans la
people
précarité.
switch over
Et c'est
into
ça la
a position of
vulnérabilité
precarity.
énergétique,
And that's
comme
what
on peut
the
l'entendre
energy
d'ailleurs
policy
de la
needs to include when you
vulnérabilité
talk
au
about
sens du
vulnerability in the
et en
sense
lien
of the
avec l'accord climat.
IPCC in
Donc,
accordance
on a
with the climate agreement.
Un problème de
So we have
fragmentation
a
des
problem
données
of fragmentation of
à
data
l'échelle nationale, à l'échelle européenne,
and the
qui
national and European
empêchent d'avoir
scales,
des
which stop us
indicateurs
from having
harmonisés au niveau
harmonized
européen.
indicators on the European
Et à
level.
défaut de définition
And
européenne
since
de
there are
la
no European
pauvreté
definitions of
énergétique,
energy
il
poverty,
faudrait des critères
we need
standardisés
standardized
pour
criteria,
évaluer ce
thus,
phénomène
to assess
de la
these
précarité
phenomena
et de la vulnérabilité.
precarity and vulnerability.
Et donc, en fait, il faut tenir
So we
compte de
need
la
to take into
caractère
account
multiforme des
the multiform
vulnérabilités
characteristic of energy
énergétiques
vulnerability
et de la difficulté
and
à
the
déterminer
difficulty in
précisément
determining
les
precisely
besoins qui doivent être
the
couverts.
needs that need to be covered.
Et puis, il faut éviter de
And we need
développer
to
des
avoid
politiques de lutte contre
developing
les changements
policies
climatiques
to fight against
qui ne prendraient
climate
pas en
change that would not
considération
take into
les
account
difficultés
the difficulties
particulières des plus démunis
of the
et qui pourraient donc
underprivileged
accroître les
and that
inégalités.
will increase
On l'a vu
inequality.
avec les gilets jaunes,
We've
la
seen that
question
with the
énergétique
yellow
sociale,
vests.
la mobilité.
It's also a question of mobility.
Il en découle qu'une approche
And what results from
globale,
that is a global approach
intégrée,
that's
est
integrated
nécessaire pour construire
and
des
is necessary to
des
build
objectifs de justice
objectives that are
énergétique
fair and energy
qui s'inscrivent
justice,
dans
as
un
it were,
projet
that are part of a national
national
and
et
European
de justice climatique,
climate justice
au-delà de la
project
seule transition
beyond only just the energy
Alors,
transition.
comment analyser la
So
précarité
how can we
énergétique?
assess
Quels objectifs
energy poverty?
et comment
What are the
prendre
objectives?
en
And how can
considération
we take
la
energy
vulnérabilité
vulnerability
énergétique?
into account?
D'abord, définir par des
First of all, we need to share definitions about energy policy or poverty. At the European level, the concept of energy poverty, the deprivation of energy is all important. We have to take into consideration the complexity of the phenomena and the consequences of depriving people of energy on individuals and on society as a whole. So depriving people of energy stops people from benefiting from decent conditions of living. They also stop activities in society. So this is really in relationship with fundamental human rights. So we're not supporting a fixed problem, but a dynamic problem, a societal issue. It's a problem that can lead to the collapse of national solidarity. And behind that, a universal right to energy is a consideration very much in the forefront. So what about fragilization of households in terms of energy consumption? The low revenue, poor thermal quality of the housing, and lack of availability of energy. We are indeed in a context such as that right now. According to these criteria, more than 10% of households would be in the poorest, amongst the poorest households. We don't necessarily agree on those criteria, but behind these issues of precarity and vulnerability, there's some very strong social factors as well. In terms of urban construction, access to housing, transportation. So we have to assess these various problems based on social cohesion and territorial cohesion, and that needs to be part of climatic justice. We need to consider not only buildings and housing, but also mobility. The right to mobility is a recognized right where all territories are not equal in this respect. We need to take into account access to forms of mobility that are not polluting, which is essential. So how do we move towards a better energy justice, a fairer energy? We have to think more than just about distribution to compensate revenue and help households, not only in terms of their expenses. We have to develop highly structuring activities that are over the long haul and that are preventive in nature. From this point of view, we have principles of energy justice that are adequation between needs and services. An approach in terms of the capacity of individuals to take action and to develop in their environment. And the third principle is procedural in terms of equality of right, the ability of people to defend their rights and to be protected from this precarious situation. So what are the areas of action? We need to think about these sector by sector and between the sectors. We need to mobilize public policy to have more structuring activity over the long haul, thermal renovation to reduce sustainably the demand of energy on households and to protect them against price increases, which is important. And thermal renovation gives rise to a whole series of problems of inadequacy of the housing available, access to housing, and also behind that, the whole question of support in professional areas that are organized and to provide frameworks for that. This requires that we talk about real estate speculation. We can't think about that without taking a closer look at real estate speculation. That the energy precarity should not hide inequality in this respect and the suffering that brings about the price of real estate. We need to have a regulation of the market to protect consumers, to verify the adequation of prices in the market with respect to market conditions, and avoid market manipulation by suppliers, and avoid special pricing which can increase inequality. And we need to think further. Urban development and urban development mobility need to be considered ahead of time in the climate pact, in a global approach. And that's what we've was recommended by the French EESC. We have to have a new logic of urban planning, which includes urbanists and mobility experts, so as to develop cities that consume less carbon, or that produce less carbon, and to optimize the means of mobility. So we need to recompose the city to take into consideration beyond just the question of housing. Think about the speed at which the private housing is being renewed or renovated as the public housing. Think about remediation activities that are harmonized to provide a framework for spontaneous habitation. In conclusion, energy justice can only be realized fully without a cross-cutting approach and an integrated approach which will mobilize all of the public authorities: transport, housing, urban planning, and health. This has to be included in a more global policy of climatic policy to promote between governments and territories and generations. Perfect, thank you. Thank you. Just one question before we move on to the discussion. You focused your speech on social inequality, but almost within a state. What about climate justice? The link between energy and climate is also an aspect that's international. In the group report from the IPCC that was published on Monday, there was a section, a great concern concerning isolated areas in islands, for example, with rising sea levels, and maybe it's too late for them. What do you think about that particular, more international vision? This is a question that's so interesting because France has 17 overseas territories, and these areas are particularly vulnerable as islands to rises in sea level. So all of the dimensions of the negative impact of climate change on particularly vulnerable areas, which are insular areas, and they're very far, and with different legal statuses. In Polynesia, for example, are more autonomous than the Antilles. So we have an increase in climate-related risk in these areas, and the question with respect to energy in these areas is indeed even more important because there are very limited options, and we're far from national territory. I'm thinking particularly about France, but we could also talk about other nations where there can be policies decided centrally on the national scale, but you have a hard time finding the same application and the same resources in islands that are outlying under very different conditions. Personally, I work on the conditions of energy in these islands is nothing to do with the problems in France. So we have a level of adaptation which is extremely relevant and adapted to these territories, and even within French Polynesia, which is immense. You have to have a distinction made between the islands. So from an energy point of view, this is central. It needs to be rolled out, taking into account the specific nature of the territory. We need to arrive at finding the means between a national policy, thinking about the French CNAP program, to be able to roll this out much more precisely in ultra-vulnerable areas, such as island areas. Thank you. Other questions for Mrs. Michelot? Hello. You spoke about questions having to do with the Transport and Housing Pact. What about the Food Safety or Food Security Pact? Maybe we could take several questions.
Yes, good morning for everybody. Mr. President, many thanks for organizing this critical topic as climate change is. The social inequality is the result or heritage of the global financial crisis. Since the global financial crisis, no progress has been made until now. My question is, there are very many international institutions which are dealing with social inequality, like the World Bank, OECD, and European Commission. And if we want to compare in terms of indicators, they are consistent and comparable with this multinational institution, or they are different? And what about your expectation where these indicators, which are critical for analysis and for doing some future development in social area, will be ready? Thank you.
Merci. Est-ce qu'il y a une autre question?
Are there any other questions?
Non. Si, Arnaud.
Arnaud.
Merci. Peut-être
Thank you.
une réaction.
Perhaps one reaction
Et des pistes de solutions.
and some ideas for solutions.
Aux informations qu'on a régulièrement.
To the information that we get regularly, we've already had figures coming in, from worldwide.
Quand on regarde.
When we look at who is emitting the most in terms of the wealth of the population, there is a minority of humans that emit the biggest greenhouse, that have the biggest greenhouse gas emissions. And so we have the right to ask ourselves whether the efforts to be made ultimately should not come above all from these persons, and that efforts in the area, both in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also in terms of transferring resources to help the most impoverished populations to face up to the consequences that are already there and that have been aggravated and will be aggravated in the upcoming years due to the prior behavior of the rich people. And should that not be one of the priorities of our policy? More recently, there was a report which demonstrated for France, we could see, I'm not going to pull out the figures now, but there were several dozen families in France who emitted almost as half of the French population, which can seem incredible, but it is true. One family is 11%, apparently. Thank you for these questions that open up a lot of, shed a lot of light on the international situation on climate justice, which basically has four dimensions. Justice between individuals, and some individuals are more exposed than others to climate-related risk, or social areas which have a hard time adapting, which is the case of finding work, for example. There are studies on vulnerability in certain social groups, and are women more exposed than men? Economically and socially, women are perhaps deprived as well. It depends on the social category. You have to be more precise. So, and justice between individuals, justice between nations as well, which is cross-cutting for the three questions above, depending on food safety, food security, and indicators of vulnerability and precarity, and including what was just said about those who emit more than others and that are going to be subjected fully to the effects of that. So equality between individuals needs to go through the meeting of human rights and social justice and environmental policy with respect to the accumulation, the cumulative effect of inequality. So this is difficult to set up. And then we have justice between the nations, which is fundamental, which is much more classically dealt with in climate-related negotiations with the principle of common shared responsibility, depending on the relative capacity of each nation. So that's a principle that's international, but can be negotiated, and it more has a role, if you see, in the aspect having to do with reducing greenhouse gas emissions, attenuating those emissions. But for adaptation, we really need to have a local and precise action. The mountain is not the same as in a tropical island. So the question of solidarity, depending on where we are and what the adaptation objectives are. Be that as it may, it gives rise to the question we spoke about earlier about resources that we have to be setting up. And then the question of justice between generations. There are indicators we're talking about. We need to consider that the decisions that are made now, we no longer need to assess an environmental impact at a time t, but it's t plus 1. But that's not done. I've been told it's really hard to do. But maybe we need to think about that. To do environmental impact studies. We take decisions that will have effects over a very long time. And in the middle term as well. Or even short term. So lastly, there are increasingly questions arising about between territories, inequality between territories. We have this problem more in France because there are ultramarine territories that don't have the same resources in some as the metropolitan city regions. So that's so we have to talk about dividing up the resources between those territories, taking into account the vulnerabilities and the inequality of resources. One last aspect of justice that we haven't spoken about is between species. Why are some species? Why should some species become extinct and not others? So about food security, you are absolutely right. About food security, this is a major point, which is based both on a national context and an international context, because the climate, the founding of the climate has an effect on our ability to produce. I can give you an illustration in the region of France that I come from, which is New Aquitaine, where resources depend on our ability to produce in farming. So we are moving towards a food crisis. We are moving towards a food crisis, but which is not felt in the same way in the territories in West Africa, for example, where we're going to have a diversity of various situations. We're going to have more or less to cover the food security problem. But getting back to current events, food security that we're living through now with the Ukrainian context is going to have consequences that are major in terms of destabilization. Don't forget the role that Ukraine played in producing cereal. Obviously, here is an unusual context, but we're in a worldwide system in terms of the food production, where the climate system weighs heavily on resources and the way in which we are producing and consuming. And if we don't change the model, obviously, the food security is a problem where we're already in this problem. It's just going to be accentuated by the crisis. So we're going to be feeling the full force of this. So this is a problem that involves the international level with a breakdown of resources which is no longer going to be the same, with different levels of attenuation depending on the steps that will be planned, and European policy will be central in that. And to draw the parallel with the question that was raised about developing nations, do we not have a duty to provide help? Here, we have such a vulnerability, thinking particularly about Africa currently, that we're going to be generating, this is going to be explosive. And that's also what was said by the IPCC. So we cannot think about this without thinking about the international aspects and taking into account European policy. Now, about the indicators. These are crucial to agree on what is precariousness in terms of energy, and how do we take into account vulnerabilities? So if we categorize things too much, from the social point of view, we'll have difficulties. We're going to be segmenting the problem. We need to get out of that approach. We need to have a more trans-sectorial approach centered on vulnerability and on the relative wealth of populations. So that requires, to my way of thinking, that's what was expressed by the EESC's opinion. On the national level, we need to rethink, not only for investors, by investors, but in connection with climate policy. But that needs to be done. Thank you. I'd like to raise a question that's outside of the framework of the debate, but I'm taking advantage of your presence. The whole issue of legal recourse, which is made increasingly against governments. A lot of young people, notably in Europe, have participated in this. Now, is the fact of engaging a lawsuit for client inaction is interesting? Does that have an impact? Does that help things to get moving? I'll give you a quick answer. There are dozens of governments where there is ongoing litigation, and France is no exception to that. So each procedure and each means of action is different in these cases. There are actions that can be undertaken with respect to private companies or with respect to the government. Be that as it may, whether these actions succeed or not, some do succeed. They only have a symbolic value, essentially. We're defending for future generations. We're defending the right to have a healthy environment. And we're putting forward priorities. And just by doing that, the climate litigation, even if it's the tip end of the problem, because once you reach that point, it means we haven't succeeded in anything. That only has the symbolic value is that we have to move forward the conscience of ecology, and this contributes to that. Is there one question remaining in the room? Any more questions from the floor? Okay. What I suggest, since the next panel is not yet here, let's have our break right now, and we'll start up again in 10 or 15 minutes. We'll meet back here to pick up on the second panel discussion. So we'll see you in a few minutes.